today we're going to pick up where we left off last time. We were taking a look at ancient Israel, and we were looking at the birth of Judaism. And today we're going to be continuing on with the advent of Christianity, 1st century A.D., the origin of a movement that is going to originally be part of Judaism and is eventually going to separate off of Judaism. And as we get into this, I'm probably going to go a little bit into the first few centuries of the Roman era, but I'm not going to go very far beyond that. I'm probably going to talk not only about the origins of Christianity, but I'm going to get up through the legalization of Christianity, when Christianity actually comes to dominate the Roman Empire, and that's about where we're going to finish. So this is, again, very early Christianity, and we'll just pick up here. This is part 2, Ancient Israel, Early Christianity, Historical Overview. So let's take a look at the very pivotal figure of Jesus of Nazareth. I'm going to put this into certain time periods as we've done before with ancient Israel, and we're going to start with the period that we're going to say is between 4 or so BC to AD 95. We'll call this the New Testament era because this is not only the time period where the events of the New Testament take place, but it's also the period where the New Testament documents themselves are compiled, written down, and basically written down. They're not necessarily compiled into a single book until much, much later, but they're all written. Okay, all of the books, the 27 books of the New Testament written during the 1st century. The debate as to exactly when that would have been finished, kind of the end date that many suggest is somewhere around the mid-90s. Okay, and the last book that was probably written would have been the Apocalypse of John, more commonly known as the book of Revelation. Okay. Now, let's start with the figure of Jesus of Nazareth and when he was born. And this is going to be maybe a surprise to some people because most people tend to think he was born in the year 1. As a matter of fact, the whole distinction between BC, AD, or what is now called BCE and CE, that division in dating is actually based on the estimation of when Jesus was born. Okay, it was actually a miscalculation, which is why we're going to place his birth actually prior to 1 AD, which would be the traditional idea. AD standing for Anno Domini, the Latin for the year of our Lord. BC just means before Christ. Okay, I don't think I've gone through those designations, but I think most people are familiar with that. They've been replaced, and I'm used to using that, which is why I've been doing that all along. It's kind of the designation that I grew up with, but today, most textbooks are going to say BCE for before Common Era and CE for Common Era. Okay, so Jesus was born somewhere between 6 and 4 before Christ. Okay, so he was born before himself in a certain way. But the estimation is actually based on calculations regarding the life of Herod the Great, who he ended up with last time. Herod the Great died around 4 BC. Now, we know that Herod the Great, according to the accounts that we find in the Gospels, was alive at the time of Jesus' birth. So Jesus must have been born some period before Herod died, which puts us in a window of several years. Okay, you'll see this vary from scholar to scholar, whether it's 8 to 4 BC or somewhere along those lines. Okay, so we're just going to stick with that general vicinity. Not that important, actually, when this happened. What's more important is what this figure ends up doing as he emerges on the scene in Judea. He was also another important figure that's going to be mentioned in the Gospels. The governor over the region of Judea, Pontius Pilate, would have been somewhere between 26-36 AD as far as his administration of the region. Now, as far as Jesus is concerned, he was a public figure who began teaching somewhere around 27 AD. Okay? This is during the reign of Tiberius. He was a rabbi, so he was a teacher. I don't know if I used the term rabbi last time when we talked about Judaism, but it's probably a shame if I didn't, because rabbis were the teachers of the Jewish community, very important figures. He was a rabbi who gathered around him a number of disciples, taken from the Latin term for student. And in his public teaching, he basically is proclaiming the kingdom of God, seems to be one of his core messages, but there's also the idea of a connection to messianic expectations, within Judaism, particularly Second Temple period Judaism, there were expectations as to a coming Messiah. And it gets really complicated as to what this Messiah would be like, how many Messiahs there were going to be. The number ranges. Many groups held on to the idea of maybe 2 Messiahs. They were looking for, in some senses, in some cases, a political figure, some kind of liberator that was going to free Judea from foreign oppression and foreign rule. But there were other types of messiahs as well. So Jesus seems to come into the scene with this background. Okay, at least his followers are going to come to view him as the prophesied Messiah. And in his teaching, he comes into conflict with a number of Jewish sects. We didn't really talk about the different sects within Judaism during this era, but there were a number of them. And let's take a look at some of the major ones. When we talk about conflict with these groups, it's basically due to some of the things that Jesus is teaching that cut against some of the things that they are standing for. So we're talking Second Temple period Judaism. And in this era, we can look at the Pharisees, the Purusha, the Sadducees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. Okay, those are the 4 groups that are worth discussing. There were smaller other groups that you could throw in here, but for the most part, these are the big 4 that most people are at least somewhat familiar with. The Pharisees are at the top, and this is a group that Jesus is going to have a lot of interaction with. You can see a number of times in the gospel accounts that he has an encounter with the Pharisees where there are disagreements, usually over adherence to the law, things like that. Jesus seemed to be very critical of kind of a blind following of the law as opposed to the idea behind the law. Okay, I'm just going to simplify and not really get into much theology or specific teachings. But the Pharisees, if you want to know what they were like, they were the ones who definitely maintained the authority of the Torah among the Hebrew Scriptures, but they accepted more than just the Torah. They accepted the majority of really all the documents that we have today in the Hebrew Bible, or what's now, in Christian viewpoint, the Old Testament. They definitely emphasized Mosaic law, but also had what was called the oral Torah, or the oral law, the tradition that supposedly went back to Mount Sinai as well, but was not written down. Okay. Now, they were also the group that was represented by Rabbinic Judaism, which is why Jesus, does seem to have a lot of connections there. They opposed Hellenization, which was a thing that we talked about at length. Right? We talked specifically last time about the Seleucid attempt to Hellenize the Jews back in the 2nd century BC, which led to the Maccabean revolt and the liberation of Judea from Greek control, okay, for at least a time period until the Romans came in. So they opposed that kind of culture. They were purists in the sense of wanting to be, straightforward monotheistic Jews with a unique identity. But they did recognize the authority of the Sanhedrin, okay, which was the high council in Jerusalem as far as legal matters go. Okay, now this was the Sadducees. Let's go into the second group. The Sadducees were important in that they controlled really the temple precinct and the rites of the temple. Okay. Now, they were much more conservative when it came to Jewish texts. They only recognized the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. They did not recognize the oral tradition or any of the other Hebrew scriptures. On the other side, they did support Hellenization. They were Hellenized Jews who embraced Greek philosophy and all the Greek culture that came with it, which made them really controversial, and one of the reasons the Pharisees were in many ways opposed to the Sadducees. They did deny certain teachings that are going to be prominent in later Judaism and definitely in Christianity, the idea of a life after death, the idea of a resurrection. Those really are very strong within Christian teaching. But like I said, they focused on the temple and controlled that aspect of Judaism, okay, right there in Jerusalem. The Essenes are an interesting group. They are a purist movement to the extreme, where they adopt kind of an ascetic lifestyle and actually withdraw from other Jewish communities and from Jerusalem, which they saw as really having become corrupt. Okay, the people back home, especially the Sadducees, would have been considered breakers of covenant in their perspective. Now, they had communal living. They focused on piety, righteousness, study, copying of scriptures. They definitely engaged in ritual purification. That was a big thing. If you ever go to Qumran by the Dead Sea, which seems to be an Essene community, or the remains of an Essene community, you notice lots of what are called baptismal pools or mikvaot. Okay, so it was a daily practice of bathing for ritual purposes, not for just, hygiene. Okay, they rejected things like the animal sacrifice, which were conducted back in Jerusalem at the temple. So this is a very unique group, and this is the group that's usually identified or connected with what are known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, some texts that we'll talk about when we get into the canon in another lecture. And then the last group that's worth mentioning are the kind of the political wing of Judaism, the Zealots. Okay, we use the term even today to be zealous. They're the ones that are passionately after separation, or liberation rather, of Judea from outside control. Specifically in this era would be the Romans. Okay, so it's a political liberation movement, and they're in favor of actual armed revolt against Rome. And we're actually going to see in the middle of the first century an actual war of liberation between Jews and Romans. Okay, so we'll just hold off on that only briefly. But those are the groups. Okay, so putting this stuff into context, let's get to the end of Jesus' life. We know that he taught, he had conflict with various groups, and then at some point he was crucified. By all accounts, he was executed by the Romans on charges which would have been political, or probably more so than religious, though the texts in the Gospels indicate Jewish opposition, like we just mentioned, that would have been over religious issues, particularly the idea of claiming to be Messiah or even Son of God. But as far as the Romans were concerned, as religious as they weren't necessarily all that concerned with kind of local religious ideas. They would have been more concerned with the idea of somebody presenting themselves as king. And it seems to be the charge that was eventually the one tacked onto the cross above him, that he claimed to be King of the Jews. If you see depictions of Jesus' crucifixion with a little plaque that says INRI, which is a Latin abbreviation of a Latin Jesus Nazareus Rex Judorum, which means Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. So that was the charge leveled against him, which was a capital offense to be in some ways a political opponent of Rome. Now, the disciples after this event, which would have been incredibly devastating, right? Their leader, their teacher, being put to death by the state, began to proclaim that he rose again. And this becomes really the beginning of Christianity and the core message that the Christian community is going to spread. And at some point, this movement, which was part of Judaism early on, and I don't want to underestimate the connection between Jews and Christians because they're almost indistinguishable for a long while in the early church. Eventually, these movements break apart. Christianity is going to diverge from Judaism. Okay, and we'll see maybe how that happens in a little bit. The event of Pentecost is also going to be a moment which begins the spread of Christianity outwardly, at least according to texts like we find Acts of the Apostles. Okay, so the most important figure, I think, in early Christian spread, or the spread of the Christian message, particularly outside Judea, is going to be a figure by the name of Saul of Tarsus, better known as the Apostle Paul. Now, what we know about him, and we have a lot of his writings that have been preserved, they're the letters that he wrote, the epistles of Paul. Also, we know about him from, again, Acts of the Apostles, which kind of focuses on his life. It's not written by him, but it's written by Luke. We know that he was originally a Pharisee. He was a Jew, a devout Jew who became an opponent of the sect of Christians very, very early on. And the story is that he actually persecuted Christians. He was somebody who kind of tracked them down. But at some point fairly early on, we'll say around 35 A.D., he converts to Christianity, has an experience, and he then becomes a Christian, and he's going to be known as the apostle to the Gentiles because he begins to take the Christian message to non-Jews. The Gentile would be a term that just designates anybody that's not Jewish. And along with this, you're going to see slowly more and more a separation from Jewish religion, ritual, law, and all the rites that would have been associated with Judaism, particularly, the idea of circumcision, which you can imagine if you're trying to spread Christianity to non-Jews who had not yet been circumcised. There was the big issue. One of the big issues that came up in the early churches, do they have to convert to Judaism first, which would have required a circumcision, and that could be a little bit off-putting for the most part. So You're going to start to see, again, kind of a setting aside of those types of requirements. If you're going to become a Christian and you're not a Jew, you don't need to convert to Judaism first. You don't need to go through the circumcision. You don't need to adopt Jewish dietary law. Those types of things we see come out in the discussions kind of around Paul and some of the things that he dealt with in various communities. So he's going to be really, really important in not just how he spreads the message outside Judaism, but because of his writings, because of his education, he's able to converse at an intellectual level with, the Hellenistic world, the Greco-Roman culture. And he's really going to be the big theologian behind Christianity. So what we have in the Gospels is really kind of the account of Jesus' life and teachings. What we get in the epistles of Paul are going to be the theological interpretations of those things. And this is really where Christianity starts to formulate, within those writings. So he's really, really important. Some people, I've heard scholars even put him as more important for the birth of Christianity than Jesus himself. I think it's a little bit of an extreme position, but nonetheless, it's been out there. All right, New Testament era. Let's move forward into the 40s. We've got some events that we're just kind of highlight as we move through the rest of the century. I think these are some of the big things. There was an expulsion of Jews from Rome under the reign of Emperor Claudius. And it seems to be due to Jewish-Christian conflict. The very fact that this took place, and it's mentioned in several places. It's mentioned in Acts 18. It's mentioned in the Roman historian Suetonius' account of Claudius's life. Actually, according to Suetonius, he says that since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, Claudius, expelled them from Rome, which lines up with what Acts accounts, talking about, that Claudius ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. So we got, various attestations of this event. It tells us a couple things about the spread of Judaism, right? Jewish communities have already spread well beyond Judea. So I don't want you to think that they're kind of just localized right there. Lots of Jews already in Rome. Probably a number of them brought over in slavery because Romans took lots of people back to Rome after their various conquests. But there was a big Jewish community there, and you can imagine there's now a growing Christian community. Suetonius' reference to Chrestus seems to be, and some people interpret this as a reference to Christ, maybe just a corruption of the name, which would have been a reference again to early Christian followers. And we don't know if this is Jews and Christians in conflict again. And again, it's very possible that you're dealing with Jewish Christians in the Jewish community that are really indistinguishable to the Romans. How do you tell a Jew or a Christian apart? Because, Jewish Christians often continue to go to synagogue and practice Judaism. But we do know that there was an expulsion of them, probably a very small portion of the population, maybe just the instigators of the disturbance that's mentioned, kicked out in 49. So already we're getting into some conflict in the city of Rome, and this is where it gets really bad in 64. We're going to see our first Roman persecution of Christians, and this is under the Emperor Nero. Now, this was an incredibly unpopular persecution. We'll talk more about persecutions later, and I'll actually tell you how this pretty much began, but it does result in the execution of a number of Christians. Nero, generally a bad guy in Christian, actually not just Christian history, he's kind of a bad guy in all of Roman history or history period. By 66, the Jewish war is going to begin back in Judea. This is a rebellion against Rome, begins there. It's going to last for about 4 years or so, and our accounts of the Jewish war are primarily coming from the Jewish historian Josephus, Flavius Josephus. In 67, we could place somewhere around this time the death of both Paul, who we just mentioned, and who many consider the lead apostle. I didn't really mention the term apostle, but the apostles are the 12 main leaders of the Christian community after the death of Jesus. Peter was considered by many to be the lead apostle. The tradition is that both of these guys were executed in the city of Rome, probably somewhere after the persecution of Nero, possibly after it had even ended, but somewhere around the late 60s. Next in line, we've got the finishing up of the Jewish war. Jerusalem is taken and destroyed, the temple itself, the entire temple torn utterly down to the ground by AD 70. Okay, and this is going to be under Titus, who was the son of the Roman emperor at the time, Vespasian. And it leads to a diaspora, a word that we used before when we talked about the Babylonian captivity. It's a dispersion of Jews. So you're going to have more and more Jews leave the vicinity, leave the region, and go elsewhere. And again, bring with them their Judaism, but also you can imagine the Christian Jews are part of this. So we'll talk about how this may even help the spread of Christianity in the late first century. Now, even though the Jewish war effectively had come to a conclusion, there are still other factions within Judea that had held out against the Romans. One particular group is kind of a splinter group from the Zealots known as the Sicarii. They're known as being kind of assassins. Years earlier, I mean, you may have heard of the assassins of the Hashashin from the Middle Ages. This is a Islamic assassin guild. The Sicarii are kind of an earlier version of that. They slaughtered the Roman garrison that was at Masada. The picture that I just show you on the screen is basically the fortress of Masada. A lot of the front part here, you can see the Palace of Herod. It was really an elaborate complex out in the Judean wilderness, a place of refuge and security, very difficult to assault this plateau from below. And the Roman garrison there was slaughtered by the Sicarii. Josephus says they actually went ahead and slaughtered, women and children in nearby villages. This is a pretty radical group. And ultimately, the Romans march on Masada in 73 under the commander Silwa, besiege Masada and build a ramp all the way up to the top of it. And this is really an insignificant group, speaking of, the actual threat to the Roman Empire. But the Romans are going to make an example out of them. But Josephus tells us that the Sicarii do not allow themselves to be taken alive. And by the time the Romans are about to batter their way into the citadel, the 960 or so people that remained on top had all died. It was kind of a murder-suicide pact that they had taken. Okay, so the Romans really don't capture anything other than the fortress once again. If you go there today, the ramp going up to the top is still there. You can walk it. As a matter of fact, I was in the region not that long ago, and this was one of the highlights of my trip over there. It was kind of a sunrise walk up the Roman ramp up to the top of Masada. And then we came down the other side of the hill. There's a snake path that comes down the other way. So it's a great day's hike. Gets a little hot if you don't do it at sunrise, I guess, but it was really a pretty awesome experience. Anyways, the New Testament closes around 95. Like I said, the last book probably composed was the Apocalypse of John. All right, move on and let's take a look at further Jewish and Christian relations with Rome. After the destruction of Jerusalem, in the early 2nd century, the Emperor Hadrian founds a new colony on the remains of Jerusalem, and he names it Aelia Capitolina. And this references both to Aelia, is actually one of the family names associated with Hadrian, but Capitolina is a reference back to the Capitoline Hill in Rome, where you've got the Temple of Jupiter. So this is the idea of a city dedicated to the Roman gods at this point. And there was a Temple of Jupiter actually put up on the Temple Mount, and this would have been incredibly offensive. As a matter of fact, it was incredibly offensive to the Jews, who, again, this is their most sacred site. Even though there's no temple there, it was still their most sacred site. Leads, ultimately, that, along with other things, leads to another revolution or rebellion in the region. This is called the Bar Kokhba Rebellion, led by Simon Bar Kokhba, who died in 135. At this point, Hadrian, who is still emperor, expels the Jews from Judea. He actually forbids access to the sacred city, and then renames the province. Instead of calling it Judea, it was renamed Syria Palestina. And this is where the term Palestine actually comes into history. Even today, people refer to this region as Palestine. Okay, that was thanks to the Roman expulsion of the Jews. By AD 250, we're going to start to see persecution of the Christians escalate. There is supposedly the first empire-wide persecution under the Emperor Decius. Now, this is not necessarily due to hatred of Christians. Okay, I'll make this a little bit clear when we get into persecution in a little bit, but it seemed to be more along the lines of directed at anybody within the Roman Empire that refused to do proper sacrifice to the Roman god. So it was more of a general thing, but it did result in persecution of Christians. The Great Persecution, however, doesn't come until AD 303. And this was under the Emperor Diocletian, one of the big names in the Roman Empire. We haven't really covered the Roman Empire period, but we're going to talk about him later. Right now we're kind of looking at the negative aspect of his reign, which is his connection with the Great Persecution of Christians. In AD 312, things stop as far as persecution goes. This is where things have a huge turnaround thanks to the ascension of a guy by the name of Constantine. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge takes place in 312, where Constantine defeats his opponent Maxentius at the bridge known as the Milvian Bridge right there in Rome. And the tradition that develops is that he attributes this victory over his enemy to the Christian God, and at some point he becomes himself a Christian. He doesn't get baptized until his deathbed, but it doesn't mean that he wasn't already a Christian earlier. He definitely seems to be a process in his Christianization, but he's definitely going to be a proponent, an advocate for Christianity. Okay, so the big event that takes place very soon after his ascension to position as emperor, at least an emperor in the West, because there were two emperors at the time, is that he signs what's called the Edict of Milan in 313. And this is the document that stops persecution officially. It legalizes Christianity and begins to return church property that had been confiscated back to the church. Okay, so that's Constantine the Great. That's not it. We're going to go a little bit further. 325, still under the time of Constantine, you've got a very important council. This is the first of a whole series of what are called ecumenical councils within the early church, where the major leaders of Christianity get together to settle issues related to theology and practice. Okay, the Council of Nicaea is the first of these, and it's called to deal with a heresy that had arisen known as the Arian heresy. And we may talk about certain heresies as we go further in the semester, but this particular one dealt with the nature of Christ, the idea of, whether Jesus was God or whether Jesus was a lesser created being, which was the Arian position. And Constantine presided over the council. He wasn't necessarily the big mind behind the debate, but as emperor, he took a role in church affairs. This goes right back to Augustus, who we saw took the title of Pontifex Maximus. Right? This was a traditional role or office for all emperors. Okay, so Constantine still had that idea that he's the head of the state religion, but he does submit basically to the vote of the bishops that were there. And this is also the council that produced what's known as the Nicene Creed. If you come from a Christian tradition, most likely you've heard of the Nicene Creed because this is routinely recited in church services, whether you're Catholic, Orthodox, even Protestant groups adhere to this fundamental creed, which kind of encapsulates the basic doctrines of Christian faith, okay, at least as far as orthodoxy is concerned. 381, we have Theodosius. He was emperor 379 to 395, and he's going to begin a persecution now in the other direction. You're going to start to see persecution of non-Christians by Christian emperors. This didn't really occur during Constantine's time. Constantine's often given credit for making Christianity the official religion of Rome, which he does not do. He merely legalizes it. It's Theodosius that starts to move towards Christianity being the official religion and other religions being not only discouraged but actively suppressed. The Theodosian decrees, basically between 389 and 392, are going to be a series of edicts that are going to promote the orthodoxy of the Nicene Council, close down pagan temples, stop Roman rites, shut down sacrifice. All that kind of stuff really comes to an end under the Theodosian decrees, or at least attempts to bring it to an end. A lot of these things kind of last, they're going to linger on. You can't just get rid of people's practices in one fell swoop. Okay, but this is, like I said, the officialization of Christianity as the Roman religion. Now we're going to jump way ahead. That kind of wraps up Christianity in the early phases in a very rough sense. One last thing I'm going to mention here is that it's not until the 20th century, right? We just talked about the expulsion of the Jews from Judea by Hadrian, the Jewish wars, all that kind of stuff. It's not until the 20th century that there is another Jewish state that shows up in that region. And it's not until 1948 where Israel is effectively established, okay? A state that is still in existence today, anybody that's familiar. And I don't want it to make it sound, even though there's a state there for the first time after almost 2,000 years, I don't want to make it sound like there weren't Jewish occupants. Just because Hadrian and the Romans tried to remove Jews from the region was not absolutely successful. There's still a large Jewish community in Jerusalem and in the vicinity even after. When we get into the discussions in the Middle Ages later, we're going to eventually talk about the Crusades, and we're going to see that there's still, these people living there, and they always will be. Okay, they never completely disappear. All right, so that's at least it for Jewish-Christian relations with Rome. I want to turn and talk a little bit about the spread of Christianity and then the persecutions of Rome on Christianity. So what are some of the factors that led to the spread of the religion so rapidly, so quickly, where it becomes the state religion within a couple centuries? Well, there are various factors. I'm going to go ahead and list them and talk about them. The Hellenization of the East, the synagogues, was called the Great Commission. The Jewish reaction or rejection to Christianity is very important, and then the writing of the New Testament. Let's take these 5 first. Hellenization, you already know the process. This is where Greek culture is brought into the other Eastern world, the territories conquered by Alexander the Great. We know that we have a Septuagint, right? The Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures compiled in the 3rd century BC under the Ptolemies. Very, very important document because more and more Jews were not speaking Hebrew as their native language, particularly those that are living outside of Judea. Greek, the common language, needs to be used, and this is why, for instance, the New Testament writings are going to be written not in Hebrew, not in Aramaic, but in Greek. Okay? It's going to be most easily accessible to people of all nationalities and ethnicities, okay? And this is going to facilitate the free exchange of ideas, okay? Greek philosophy was also spreading. So all this kind of stuff kind of in the background there. This is important. The synagogues, which were the places where Jews worshipped, particularly in various places outside Jerusalem, and we were basically wherever a Jewish community was present, there would be a synagogue that was the center of their life and study and worship. Okay, so they're really important, and they're going to serve as the earliest gathering places, not just for Jewish communities, but for also the Christian community. Because remember, there's no distinction early on. If you're a Jew who converts to Christianity, basically it's just the idea of a Jew who follows Jesus as their Messiah, then they would continue, again, to live like Jews, practice Judaism, go to the synagogues, and that's going to go on for quite some time. Okay, that might not be the case with the non-Jewish convert to Christianity, but Jewish Christians, like I said, almost indistinguishable, except for a certain Jesus figure that they hold on to. Next is the Great Commission. This is actually the command, supposedly, that Jesus gave in Matthew 28 to go and evangelize the world. All right, and this is also connected with Paul's mission to the Gentiles. So it's this idea to take the message outward. That's obviously going to motivate the Christian community to then go and spread this message. The idea of evangelization is the idea of bringing a message to other people. This is one of the evangelistic religions in the world. The other big ones being Islam and Buddhism. All right, those are the religions that tend to go out and actively seek converts. Okay, so that's going to be a driving force. Of course, the Jewish rejection of Christianity is also going to have a big role to play. All right, the Jews come to slowly see Christians as other. All right, this opposition begins pretty early on. You even see this evidence in the text of the New Testament, but it's going to begin to get more and more of a division between the two. The first Jewish persecutions actually are recorded in the Acts of the Apostles, and the first martyr within the Christian community was a guy by the name of Stephen, who was a deacon in the early church. This is covered in Acts 19. Then you've got the New Testament writings. New Testament writings are all the documents, okay, that are now going to be circulated. Right? They're in Greek, and again, they're handwritten, and the letters especially are going to be sent to various communities. And it wasn't just like, for instance, Paul's letter to the Romans was designed just for the church at Rome. That letter would have been copied and then passed along to other communities. So the whole circulation of this literature is going to be really important in uniting, educating, and promoting the religion across the Mediterranean world and even beyond that. Other factors are going to be like the Pax Romana, Paul's conversion, the destruction of Jerusalem, and then the message itself. So let's take a look at these three. The Pax Romana, remember, is the peace of Rome. Really begins with Augustus. Let's say 30 BC. He finishes up the war with Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Becomes emperor officially with the title Augustus in 27. But from there, really until about 180 AD is this period of peace. Made it safe to travel. You have the Romans building roads. the seas, as far back as Pompey, kind of declared the seas free of piracy and basically made the sea kind of safe to travel as far as, worrying about pirates. It's not necessarily going to make it safe in general because you still have, obviously, weather conditions that are going to mess up that. But in general, you could travel throughout the Roman world, which is going to make it very easy for Christians to move around, for missionaries within the Christian church to go to different communities. And it's all one government. You don't have to worry about going through borders from one territory to another. It's all governed by Rome. And Paul is going to take advantage of this. So Paul's conversion is really important for several reasons. Not only is he going to be one of the big minds driving Christian theology, but he was a Roman citizen. He was a Pharisee, like I said. He was educated, not only in Jewish law, but he was also educated in Greek philosophy. As a matter of fact, in his writings, we see references and quotes from great Greek thinkers. Like I said before, he began as a persecutor of the church, but became an apostle to the Gentiles. So again, his activity, which brought him to Asia Minor, to Macedonia, to Greece. Eventually, he arrives in Rome. Not necessarily, he wanted to go to Rome, but he's actually eventually taken to Rome as a prisoner. And that's where he's eventually going to die, somewhere in the window, like I said, by 67 AD. Next, the destruction of Jerusalem is actually important for the spread of Christianity because of the diaspora. Like I said, it's going to also bring not only Jews leaving the vicinity, but also Jewish Christians who are now going to move into other communities, bringing their religion with them. And then finally, we've got the message itself, which is an alternative to other popular personal religious movements that were already active, right, in the Hellenistic world. We talked about the Hellenistic mystery cults. A number of them that were already there. The cult of Magna Mater, the cult of Isis, those were already there. The cult of Mithras was going to spring up not long after Christianity. So again, there's going to be this, not necessarily competition, but at least we know that there is that active pursuit of these types of religious experiences by people throughout the region. This is going to make it an attractive alternative to the Hellenistic religions. This is another exotic religion that's connected to Judaism. Okay, it's going to bring, like I said, lots of converts in a very quick time period, which is one of the reasons we think, by the 40s, remember, Claudius is already reacting by kicking the Jews out of Rome. So, we're talking about a quick spread of Jesus died around 30 to 33 AD, and by the end of the 40s, Jews, at the instigation of Christians, are going to be kicked out of Rome. That tells you already, within a couple decades, how far the religion had spread. Now, maybe it's the rapid spread of Christianity that's going to lead to some of these persecutions, but let's talk about the persecutions. Number one, whatever persecutions took place in Judea at the hands of the Jews, as is recounted in the New Testament, this would be localized and probably very brief and temporary. The Jews didn't really actively persecute Christians very much. As a matter of fact, there were a lot of Jewish leaders of the time that actually said, kind of just let them be, the movement will die out on its own. That was one particular perspective. The Roman persecution is the one that we really need to talk about. Now, this is also going to be not a routine policy. This is a periodic persecution by the Roman government. It starts up here and there. There are actually a lot of emperors that are blamed for persecutions. They never actually persecuted Christians. For instance, one of the supposed most notorious emperors was a guy by the name of Domitian. Apparently, it seems most historians don't believe he ever actively persecuted Christians at all. Okay, but the thing that makes this really sporadic is that Romans tended to be very open, as we saw, to various other religions. They were syncretistic. They tolerated Judaism. They actually gave Judaism a protected status within the empire. Which is really important. And the Jews are really distinct from other religions. Like they said, they welcomed other gods. They would have had no problem worshiping a Christ. Okay? So, where is the problem? The problem that's posed by Christianity is in relation to the worship of the state gods. That becomes for them a political issue. They don't care what Christians believe in their personal life. If you're not doing your duty as a Roman citizen or as a subject of Rome to sacrifice to the state gods, that makes you look like a treasonous individual, right? Maybe a political revolutionary. And the Romans, also being somewhat superstitious themselves, would have seen any kind of offense to the gods as a potential danger to the state. So these things are tied together. Remember, there's no separation of religion and state in the ancient world. Now, Christians and Jews both refused to worship the Roman gods. But like I said, the Jews were given a special status. All right. Now, what made it difficult for the Christians is that the Jews slowly became more and more aware that Christians were different, and they started to consider it not a branch of Judaism anymore. So once Christianity was kind of outside the protection of a Jewish identity, then it's not protected, and the Christians are going to be targeted for some of these persecutions. And like I said, the rapid growth is also going to be a problem for the Roman perspective. Now, there are various ways that Christianity actually appears to the Romans, and there are certain accusations that are leveled against the Christians that some people today are, even if you're aware of persecution, you might not be aware of all the reasons. Number one, you've got this idea that Christians are bad citizens. That would be clearly when they don't sacrifice to the state gods. The other area of suspicion has to do with the fact that they tended to meet in private. I mean, they weren't private about their message. They were out there on the streets, making converts and stuff like that. But when they gathered together in private homes. Now, when the Romans saw citizens or people gathering together in number in private, this looks like, fomenting of rebellion, that type of thing. The Romans would have been very suspicious of that type of activity. Okay? And they also saw Christians as somewhat superstitious in general, that they deviated. And what we mean by superstition here, when I talk about superstition among the Romans, is they believed in spiritual powers. They believed in a lot of reality of, spiritual forces and ghosts and curses and all kinds of stuff like that. The Christian community did the same, but they were viewed as superstitious in that they kind of deviated from the norms of Roman religious practice. Okay, this was an aberration in religion from their point of view. And they were accused of things like magic and sorcery. As a matter of fact, those are some of the biggest accusations against Jesus. That's kind of the tradition that's even carried down into non-Christian writings, that Jesus was a sorcerer. Okay, so that connection is there, and that's a negative thing for the most part. And then the big charges come in with the idea of accusing them of atheism, cannibalism, and incest, which might be one of the most bizarre ideas, if anybody's familiar with Christianity, because we tend to think of these three things as absolutely abhorrent to Christians. Okay, but we do get this idea from reading people like Minucius Felix, Athenagoras, Tertullian. Atheism was due to the idea that they rejected the Roman gods, right? It's not that they're rejecting the idea of a god. They are happy to worship the one God, but they do reject all of the others. So that's, in a sense, an atheism from the Roman perspective. Cannibalism and incest, those are other issues that are also related to Christian behavior and language, I think, for the most part. So why cannibalism? Did they actually believe, or actually did they actually practice eating of human flesh? Well, from the Roman perspective, that's what they heard. And this probably, again, comes from things like discussing the Eucharist, right? The idea of eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ. So that kind of language, right? It's literally wine and bread. But, the language makes it sound like when they get together in these private homes, they're doing these horrible, horrible rituals, eating of human beings. And that's something the Romans would have been opposed to. As bloodthirsty as the Romans could be when it comes to their entertainment and the gladiatorial combats, they were definitely not in favor of human sacrifice and some of those other things. Incest, another bizarre accusation, but where would that come from? Again, language. How do Christians refer to one another? Brother and sister. So you got these stories of, brothers marrying sisters and all that kind of stuff. So the Roman, audience that's not familiar is going to think, yeah, this is a group that's given over to all kinds of moral corruption, and one of the reasons it leads to some of this negative viewpoint from the Romans. Anyways, highlights of the persecution. First one, which I mentioned before, was the one under Nero. Now, I said I was going to give you a little bit more information, and this is in the context of a fire that broke out in the city of Rome in the year 64. Now, the fire destroyed a good portion of the center of the city. Nero, who was not the best emperor already, he was kind of known for his love of art and performance. Supposedly, and this is a story, he sang while he watched the city burn, playing the lyre. Right? You've probably heard the phrase, Nero fiddled while the city burned. Supposedly he was singing the story of the fall of Troy while he was watching the city burn. But what happened afterward is he ended up buying up a lot of the burned out property and then building for himself a huge palace known as the Domus Aurea, the Golden House of Nero, which covered almost the entire center of the city. I mean, the Romans were saying he was going to take over the entire city and even go beyond that to the ancient city of Veii. He's so ambitious. He wants to have the biggest house in the world. But just to let you know how big this house was, the Colosseum, which was not there at the time, was built over the lake that he had made on that spot, which would have been actually inside the vicinity of his home. Okay, so his home was bigger and spread out much wider than the Colosseum, but that's the general place that it was located. Now, people started to blame him for setting the fire. All right, so he was saying that, he set the fire intentionally so he could buy up this property for the building of this house, and Nero didn't want to assume the blame, so he passed the blame on to this suspicious group of Christians. All right, that's where the first persecution came from. It had nothing really to do with religion whatsoever, and like I said, it was very unpopular for the Romans. But at least it was localized. It was there in Rome. This was not an empire-wide thing. 250, we see the first empire-wide persecution. Only local persecutions up until that point, off and on. But in 250, you've got Decius come along and require a certificate showing that you've sacrificed to the state gods. Okay? And that becomes a problem for the Christians who are refusing to do this. Now, some Christians probably did this. As a matter of fact, we know some Christians did this. But most Christians that were really serious refused to abandon, the exclusivity of monotheistic practice and do something that they would consider actually abhorrent. So that's going to lead to persecution around the empire. The Great Persecution comes in 303. This is the worst of them. It's actually not Diocletian's idea, but it was his co-emperor Galerius that kind of pushes forward this idea. And this is the worst. Like I said, you have confiscation of scriptures, church property seized, Christians executed. They're kicked out of office, those that had already taken positions within the government, because there were a number. This is like the lowest point for Christians. And, the Romans actually believed that they had wiped out the Christian scriptures, wiped out Christianity at the time. Unfortunately for them, in their attempt to confiscate scriptures, you can imagine the average Roman soldier that might go in and try to take away books of the Bible from various communities didn't really know Greek. I mean, Greek was an international language, but most Roman soldiers in the West couldn't read it. So you had Christians hiding this stuff or turning over copies of Homer in place of copies of the scripture, the soldier not knowing the difference. Okay, anyways. You do have a very brief period of toleration, actually, surprisingly, under Galerius. Later on, he issues the Galerian toleration. Near the end of his life, very short-lived, but then persecution kind of kicks up once more until the Edict of Milan by Constantine. And that is what brings an official end, and a complete end, really, to persecution of Christianity. So it starts under Nero, it stops under Constantine, all within just under a 300-year period. So, what is the organization that the church is going to take in this time period? Earliest organization from the church was very, very basic. You have the apostles, those 12 individuals that are the leaders of the community. Christians, like I said, gathered in homes or in synagogues, at least the Jewish Christians did. They read scriptures, they worshiped, they broke bread. They did things that were basically adopted from Judaism, particularly the reading of scriptures and the worship, the singing of hymns. Breaking of bread, that was a pretty common religious practice among lots of different groups, communal meals and things like that. So nothing completely unique here. Maybe the interpretation of it is going to be very different from other communities, but that's how they worshiped. It was very simple and straightforward. And they had overseers of the local communities that were known as the bishops or the episcopoi. They were the heads of the communities. You also have elders or presbyters. That's another term. And originally it seems that these two were synonymous, though there's all kinds of debate as to how you distinguish these different figures. But let's just say in the early church, the bishop or the presbyter, those are one and the same. Deacons would be another office. We talked about Stephen, the first martyr, being a deacon. These are guys that really cared for the community. They're servants to the leaders of the community, and they're really engaged in charitable work and charitable activity. Okay, which was a big focus of Christianity, the idea of caring for the poor and the sick and the needy and stuff like that. But it gradually develops. The episcopoi and the presbyters are going to diverge. The bishops, or the episcopoi, are going to oversee numerous congregations, where the presbyters, or priests, pastors, are going to oversee just the local congregation. And the bishops of the largest communities in the biggest cities are going to take more prominent position, and you're going to have a developing hierarchy. Now, the hierarchical arrangement of the early church, or really the church at the late Roman Empire period, is going to follow the design of the Roman government. Okay, so the Roman model, and this will be important later when we get to the fall of Rome, but the Roman model that really emerges under the time of Diocletian was where you have this empire, this large empire, which was too big for a single man to really govern, broken up into smaller units. You'd have a civil administrator and a military commander at each level for the most part. So at the local level, you've got the civil administrator and what's called the dux. That's where we get the word duke from. He's the military leader. Then you've got the province, which is larger, governed by a governor. The diocese, which would include a number of provinces under a vicarius, and then a number of these dioceses under a praetorian prefecture, which would be led by a praetorian prefect and a magister militum, which would have been the military commander. And then at the top is the emperor, the Augustus. Okay, and at the time of Diocletian, there's 4 of these guys. Right, 4 emperors. That's called the tetrarchy. Okay, so that's the basic structure. It's going to change here and there, but in general, the Roman Church, or the Church in the West, is going to adopt a similar structure. You've got the local parish priest. You've got the bishop over a number of parishes within a diocese. Then you've got a number of archbishops or metropolitans over a whole large archdiocese. And then at the top, you've got not one individual, but a number of guys that are known as the patriarchs. These are the biggest, highest-ranking bishops, okay? And they govern what's called the patriarchate, and here are the 5 patriarchs. You've got the Patriarch of Rome, and this is going to be the most important one in the West. He is going to get the title Pontifex Maximus, right, once held by the emperors themselves. And even today, this is going to be a title held by the Bishop of Rome, who is now referred to as the Pope. Then you get the Bishop of Constantinople. Those are the 2 biggest and most important cities at the end of the empire. Constantinople is going to be a new capital for Rome, as we'll see a little bit later on. But that picture there, by the way, the top one is St. Peter's in Rome. It's the Vatican. And then the church below that is the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, where the Patriarch of Constantinople will be. And then the other 3 big cities, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria, all of those, Constantinople through Alexandria, are located in the east. Okay, they're all part of the eastern portion of the Roman Empire. Now, when we pick up our story again, not far from now, we're going to be looking at that period that I've just been giving you a very brief sketch of with respect to Christianity in particular, but we're going to look at the Roman Empire and eventually talk about how that empire fragments into 2, and then how one of them collapses while the other, the eastern portion, where all those 4 patriarchs reside, is going to go on for quite a while longer. But I'm going to hold off on getting into that story until we're ready for it. So for now, that's hopefully a good enough overview to get an idea of what early Christianity was like. There's a lot more we could add. I haven't talked about the various sects within Christianity, various groups that the Orthodox are going to label heretical. But Christianity was a very diverse collection of practices. I should probably put that in since I didn't have time to talk about it. But we'll see later on when we get to particularly the Byzantine Empire, how there are different groups of Christians with different beliefs still contending, right, to see which one was going to really come out as the official Christianity. And, of course, it's going to be the one that is represented by the Nicene Creed, as we have seen. So for now, that's it for early Judaism and early Christianity.